Captain Sarah Mitchell pulled back on the stick as the warning lights lit up her cockpit like a Christmas tree. The F-16 Fighting Falcon shuddered beneath her, and she could feel the hydraulics failing. Below her stretched the rugged mountains of Afghanistan, their peaks cutting sharp shadows in the late afternoon sun. Viper 17, this is Bagram Control. We're showing multiple system failures. What's your status? The voice crackled through her headset, calm and professional despite the urgency. Sarah's trained hands moved across the instrument panel, running through emergency procedures she'd practiced 1,000 times but never hoped to use in combat. Bagram, Viper 17. I've got primary flight control failure, hydraulic pressure dropping fast, and my engine's running rough. I'm about 15 miles southwest of your position. The mountain ranges below looked hostile and unforgiving. This wasn't the kind of terrain you wanted to put down an aircraft, especially not in Taliban territory. Sarah had been returning from a close air support mission when her bird started falling apart. The insurgents had been getting better with their surface-to-air missiles, and it looked like they'd finally gotten lucky. Copy, Viper 17. Can you make it back to base? Sarah checked her altimeter and glanced at her engine readings. The turbofan was losing power steadily, and without hydraulics, controlling the aircraft was becoming nearly impossible. She was losing altitude fast, and the mountains were getting closer by the second. Negative, Bagram, I'm not going to make it. Preparing to eject. The words tasted bitter in her mouth. Sarah had been flying F-16s for 8 years, through 2 deployments in Iraq and now her 3rd tour in Afghanistan. She'd never had to punch out before, and the thought of losing her aircraft made her stomach clench. But staying with a dying plane over hostile territory wasn't bravery, it was suicide. Roger. Viper 17. We're scrambling search and rescue. Try to get as close to friendly territory as possible before you eject. Sarah fought the controls, trying to coax every last mile out of her wounded Falcon. The stick felt like it was fighting against her, and she could hear metal grinding somewhere behind her. The engine temperature was climbing into the red zone, and she knew she was running out of time. Through her canopy, she could see a valley opening up ahead. It looked slightly less hostile than the sheer cliff faces she'd been flying over, with some flat areas that might work for a landing zone if search and rescue could get to her quickly. But she also knew this part of Afghanistan was crawling with Taliban fighters who would love nothing more than to capture an American pilot. The decision was made for her when the engine finally quit completely. The sudden silence was deafening after hours of the turbofan's steady roar. Now she was flying a very expensive glider, and gravity was taking over. Bagram, Viper 17, engine failure. I'm ejecting now. Sarah pulled her arms tight against her body and squeezed the ejection handle between her legs. The world exploded around her as the canopy blew away, and the rocket-powered seat launched her into the thin mountain air. The force slammed her down into the seat as she shot upward, separating from her dying aircraft. The parachute deployed automatically, jerking her upright as the silk canopy caught the air above her. Below, she watched her F-16 cartwheel into the mountainside in a ball of flame and twisted metal. 8 years of training and partnership gone in seconds. But there was no time to mourn. Sarah looked around, getting her bearings as she drifted down toward the valley floor. She could see a small village about 2 miles to the east, and what looked like a road winding through the valley. Both meant potential threats. The Taliban controlled most of this area, and they definitely heard her aircraft go down. Sarah checked her survival gear as she descended. Her sidearm was secure in its holster, a standard-issue Beretta M9 with 3 magazines. She had her survival radio, some basic medical supplies, water purification tablets, and emergency rations for 3 days. It wasn't much, but it would have to do until search and rescue could reach her. The ground was coming up fast now. Sarah prepared for landing, keeping her knees slightly bent and ready to roll. The valley floor was rocky and uneven, scattered with boulders and patches of scrub brush. Not ideal, but better than a cliff face. She hit hard, rolling sideways as her parachute dragged her several yards before she could get the release mechanism activated. Pain shot through her left ankle, and she tasted blood where she'd bitten her tongue on impact. But she was alive and mostly in one piece. Sarah quickly gathered her parachute, bundling the silk fabric behind a large boulder where it couldn't be easily spotted from the air. The bright orange and white material would be like a beacon to anyone looking for her, and she couldn't afford to advertise her position to the wrong people. The silence of the mountains was broken by the distant sound of engines, vehicles moving along the road she'd spotted from the air. Sarah grabbed her survival radio and found a position behind the rocks where she could observe the valley while staying hidden. Any station, this is Viper 17. I am down approximately 15 miles southwest of Bagram. I am alive and mobile. Request immediate search and rescue. The response came back almost immediately. Viper 17, this is Pedro 24. We are en route to your last known position. Estimate arrival in 4 or 5 minutes. Can you mark your position? Pedro 24 would be an HH-60 Pavehawk helicopter from the 41st Rescue Squadron. Sarah felt a surge of relief knowing that the Air Force's guardian angels were already on their way. But 45 minutes was a long time in Indian country. Pedro 24, negative on marking position. I have vehicles moving in the valley, probably hostile. I'm going to stay concealed until I can confirm you're in the area. Roger, Viper 17. Stay low and stay smart. We're coming for you. Sarah settled in behind the rocks and tried to assess her situation. Her ankle was tender but functional, probably just a sprain from the landing. More concerning was her location. The vehicles she could hear were getting closer, and she could now make out at least 3 pickup trucks moving slowly along the dirt road, searching. Through her small binoculars, Sarah could see armed men in the truck beds, scanning the mountainsides. They'd definitely heard her aircraft go down, and they were conducting their own search and rescue operation. Except they weren't planning to rescue her. The lead truck stopped about a quarter mile from her position, and she watched through the binoculars as a group of fighters dismounted and began spreading out on foot. They were armed with AK-47s and what looked like a couple of RPGs. These weren't just opportunistic insurgents. They moved with military discipline that suggested they were experienced fighters. Sarah counted at least 12 men, maybe more still in the vehicles. Her M9 pistol suddenly seemed very inadequate. She had 45 rounds total, and even if every shot was perfect, she'd be vastly outnumbered and outgunned. The radio crackled in her ear. Viper 17, Pedro 24, we're about 20 minutes out. What's your situation? Sarah kept her voice low. Pedro, I've got multiple vehicles with armed personnel conducting search operations in my area. At least 12 hostiles on foot, probably more in reserve. They're spreading out and moving toward my general area. Copy. Can you move to an alternate location? Sarah studied the terrain around her. The valley floor offered little concealment, and moving would risk exposure. But staying put meant eventually being found when the search teams got closer. Neither option was good. Pedro, I'm going to try to move to higher ground. There's a ridgeline about half a mile north of my position. If I can reach it, I'll have better concealment and overwatch of the valley. Roger. Use caution and keep us informed. Sarah slung her survival pack and began moving carefully through the rocks, staying low and avoiding any movement that might catch the eye of a searcher. The loose stone and gravel made silent movement nearly impossible, but she did her best to minimize noise. The Taliban fighters were being thorough in their search. She could see them checking behind boulders and in crevices where a pilot might try to hide. They were working their way systematically up the valley, and it was only a matter of time before they reached her original position. Halfway to the ridgeline, Sarah's foot dislodged a small avalanche of loose rock that clattered down the mountainside. She froze, pressing herself against a large boulder and holding her breath. Had anyone heard? The answer came in the form of excited shouting from below. She'd been spotted. Muzzle flashes erupted from the valley floor as AK-47s opened fire in her direction. The rounds sparked off rocks around her, filling the air with stone chips and the whine of ricochets. Sarah drew her pistol and looked for cover, but she was exposed on the open slope. More vehicles were arriving now, and she could see fighters dismounting and beginning to move up the mountainside toward her position. The systematic search had turned into a pursuit, and she was badly outnumbered. The radio in her ear was crackling with urgent transmissions. Viper 1-7. Pedro 2-4, we're hearing gunfire. What's your status? Pedro, I'm taking fire. Multiple hostiles moving up the slope toward my position. I need you here now. We're pushing hard, but we're still 15 minutes out. Can you evade? Sarah looked up the mountainside. The ridgeline was still several hundred yards above her, and climbing it would mean exposing herself to fire from below. But staying put meant being overrun within minutes. I'm going to try to reach the ridgeline. If I can get elevation, maybe I can hold them off until you arrive. Sarah began climbing, using whatever cover she could find among the rocks and scrub brush. Behind her, she could hear the Taliban fighters calling to each other as they coordinated their advance. They were professionals, and they weren't going to make this easy. A bullet cracked past her head, close enough that she could feel the pressure wave. Sarah spun around and fired 3 quick shots at a muzzle flash below, then continued climbing. She had to reach high ground, or this was going to be over very quickly. The ridgeline seemed to get farther away with every step. Sarah's lungs burned in the thin mountain air, and her injured ankle was starting to throb with each step. But she could hear her pursuers getting closer, and fear gave her strength. Another burst of gunfire erupted from below, and this time she felt a bullet tug at her flight suit. Too close. Sarah found a defensible position behind a cluster of rocks and turned to face her pursuers. If they wanted her, they were going to have to work for it. She could see at least 6 fighters moving up the slope toward her. Spread out and using proper fire and movement tactics. These weren't untrained insurgents. They moved like soldiers. Sarah took careful aim and squeezed off 2 shots at the nearest target, watching him stumble and fall back down the slope. The return fire was immediate and intense. Bullets shattered rock around her position, forcing her to keep her head down. When the firing paused, she could hear them calling to each other in Pashto, coordinating their next move. Sarah's radio crackled again. Viper 1-7, Pedro 2-4 is 10 minutes out. Can you hold your position? Looking down at the advancing fighters, Sarah wasn't sure she could hold for 10 seconds, let alone 10 minutes. But she keyed the radio anyway. Pedro, I'll do my best, but you need to hurry. The next rush came from 2 directions at once. Sarah emptied half a magazine engaging targets to her left, then spun to face movement on her right flank. She was burning through ammunition fast, and the Taliban fighters seemed to have an endless supply of replacements moving up from the valley floor. As she reloaded her pistol, Sarah realized that her position was about to be overrun. The ridgeline was still 100 yards above her, but there was no way she could make that climb under fire. She needed a miracle, or she needed to make her own luck. That's when she saw the heavy machine gun. One of the Taliban pickup trucks had mounted a Soviet-era DSHK heavy machine gun in its bed, the same weapon the Americans called a 50 cal because of its 12.7mm bore diameter. The truck was positioned in the valley below, and the gunner was sweeping the mountainside with long bursts, trying to keep her pinned down while the infantry closed in. It was a powerful weapon, capable of effective fire out to nearly 2 kilometers. In the right hands, it could change the entire dynamic of this fight. Sarah studied the truck's position and began forming a desperate plan. The radio squawked again. Viper 1-7, Pedro 2-4 is 5 minutes out. Hang in there. 5 minutes. Sarah looked at her ammunition. 1 full magazine left, plus a few rounds in her current mag. She looked at the advancing fighters, now less than 50 yards away and moving fast. Then she looked at that heavy machine gun in the valley below. Sometimes the only way out was through. Sarah took a deep breath, said a quick prayer, and began her descent toward the valley floor. If she was going down, she was going to take as many of them with her as possible, and if she was very lucky, she might just turn their own weapon against them. The real fight was about to begin. Sarah slid down the rocky slope on her stomach, using every piece of cover she could find. The Taliban fighters above her were shouting in confusion. They'd expected her to retreat uphill toward the ridge line, not charge straight down toward their support vehicles. The element of surprise might be the only advantage she had. The pickup truck with the heavy machine gun was parked about 200 yards away on the dirt road. The gunner was still firing bursts up the mountainside, but he was shooting at her last known position, not tracking her movement down the slope. His attention was focused uphill while she approached from his flank. Sarah could see two other men near the truck, a driver who had stayed with the vehicle and what looked like a spotter or squad leader directing the machine gunner's fire. 3 targets, and she had maybe 20 rounds left in her pistol. The math wasn't good, but it was better than letting herself get surrounded on the mountainside. A loose rock shifted under her weight, clattering down toward the road. The sound made the spotter turn in her direction, and Sarah froze behind a scrub bush barely 30 feet from the truck. The man peered into the growing shadows, his AK-47 ready, but didn't immediately spot her position. Sarah held her breath and waited. Above them, she could still hear the other Taliban fighters calling to each other as they searched the rocks where she'd been hiding. They hadn't realized she'd moved yet, but it wouldn't take them long to figure it out. The spotter turned back toward the truck, apparently satisfied that the sound had just been falling stone. Sarah seized the moment and moved closer, now only 20 yards from the vehicle. She could see the details clearly now. The heavy machine gun was a DSHK on a makeshift mount, its long barrel sweeping back and forth as the gunner searched for targets. The truck was an old Toyota with armor plates welded to its sides, typical of the improvised fighting vehicles the Taliban used. From this distance, she could hear the men talking. The spotter was giving directions to the machine gunner, telling him to concentrate fire on a specific area upslope. The driver was smoking a cigarette, relaxed and confident that their prey was trapped above them. Sarah drew her pistol and took careful aim. At this range, with good positions and surprise on her side, she could probably take all 3 before they could react effectively. But she'd have to be fast and accurate. There wouldn't be time for careful aimed shots. The radio in her ear suddenly crackled to life. Viper 17, Pedro 24 is 3 minutes out. We can see smoke from your aircraft. What's your status? The transmission was loud enough that the spotter heard it and spun around, scanning the rocks frantically. Sarah cursed silently. She'd forgotten to turn down the volume. Now her position was compromised. The spotter's eyes locked onto hers, and for a split second, both of them froze. Then training took over. Sarah's first shot took the spotter's center mass, dropping him beside the truck. Her second shot shattered the driver's side window as the man behind the wheel fumbled for his weapon. The machine gunner spun the heavy weapon around toward her position, but the mount wasn't designed for quick target changes. Sarah rolled to her left as the DSHK opened fire, its massive rounds chewing up the ground where she'd been lying. The sound was deafening, like someone beating metal drums with sledgehammers. Rock chips and dirt rained down around her as she scrambled for better cover behind a boulder. The driver had gotten out of the truck and was moving around to flank her position. Sarah could hear him calling for help from the fighters on the mountainside. This was about to become very complicated. She popped up from behind her rock and put 2 quick shots into the driver as he tried to rush her position. He stumbled and went down, but the machine gunner was already swinging his weapon back toward her. Sarah dove for the next piece of cover as another burst of heavy rounds pulverized the boulder she'd been hiding behind. The gunner was good, but he was alone now, and the heavy weapon was awkward to maneuver quickly. Sarah used this to her advantage, moving from cover to cover and forcing him to keep readjusting his aim. Each time the DSHK fired, it gave away his position and attention, allowing her to advance. From upslope, she could hear the other Taliban fighters starting to move down toward the sound of the gunfight. They'd figured out that their quarry had somehow gotten behind them and was threatening their support vehicle. Sarah had maybe 2 minutes before she'd be facing a dozen angry fighters with automatic weapons. The machine gunner made a mistake, firing a long burst that emptied his ammunition belt. Sarah heard the weapon's distinctive sound change as it ran dry, and she immediately broke cover and sprinted toward the truck. The gunner was frantically trying to reload, but changing the heavy ammunition belt took time. Sarah reached the truck bed and pulled herself up just as the gunner got a fresh belt seated in the weapon. She grabbed him from behind, using her momentum to pull him away from the gun. They struggled for a moment before Sarah managed to get her arm around his throat in a chokehold. The man was stronger than she was, but Sarah had leverage and desperation on her side. She held on grimly as he thrashed and tried to break free, gradually cutting off the blood flow to his brain. After what felt like forever, he went limp in her arms. Sarah released the unconscious gunner and turned her attention to the DSHK. She'd never operated this specific model before, but heavy machine guns were fairly standard in their basic operation. This one appeared to be a Chinese-made copy of the original Soviet design, probably supplied through Pakistan years ago. The weapon was already loaded with a fresh belt of armor-piercing incendiary rounds, exactly what she needed. Sarah checked the mechanism, found the safety, and swung the barrel toward the mountainside where she could see muzzle flashes from the advancing Taliban fighters. The radio crackled again. Viper 1-7, Pedro 2-4 is 2 minutes out. We need you to mark your position for pickup. Pedro, I'm in a white pickup truck on the Valley Floor Road. I've got enemy fighters moving down from the mountainside toward my position. You're going to have a hot landing zone. Roger, Viper. We see the truck. Can you suppress the enemy positions? Sarah pressed the trigger of the DSHK and felt the weapon come alive in her hands. The recoil was massive, much heavier than any weapon she'd fired before, but the mount absorbed most of the shock. The gun hammered out rounds at nearly 600 per minute, and she could see her tracers arcing up toward the Taliban positions. The effect was immediate and devastating. The Taliban fighters had been expecting to overwhelm a single pilot with a pistol, not face suppressive fire from their own heavy weapon. Sarah walked her fire across their positions, watching figures dive for cover as the big rounds shattered rocks and splintered trees. But ammunition wasn't unlimited, and the fighters were already adapting to the new threat. Sarah could see them spreading out, trying to flank her position from multiple directions. Some of them had RPGs, and it would only take one well-placed rocket to end this fight. She swung the machine gun toward a group of fighters who were trying to move down a gully to her right. The DSHK rounds tore through their cover, forcing them back upslope. But movement to her left caught her attention. Another group was advancing using a different route, staying in dead ground where she couldn't engage them effectively. The sound of helicopter rotors was growing louder now. Sarah looked up to see the dark shape of a pave hawk approaching from the northeast, flying fast and low through the mountain passes. But she also saw something else that made her stomach clench. One of the Taliban fighters on the mountainside was shouldering an RPG, aiming at the incoming rescue helicopter. Sarah spun the DSHK around and opened fire on the RPG gunner, but he was already committed to his shot. She saw the rocket motor ignite and the projectile streak toward the helicopter, trailing white smoke. Pedro 2-4, RPG inbound from your 10 o'clock. The Pavehawk pilot reacted instantly, throwing his aircraft into a violent evasive maneuver that sent it sliding sideways through the air. The RPG flashed past, missing by what looked like mere feet. But now the helicopter was taking small arms fire from multiple positions, and Sarah could see sparks flying off its armored skin. Viper 1-7, this is getting too hot for a normal pickup. We need you to move to an alternate landing zone. Sarah looked around desperately. The valley floor was relatively flat here, but it was also completely exposed to fire from the mountainsides. The helicopter couldn't land safely with Taliban fighters holding the high ground around the entire area. Then she remembered her survival training. Sometimes you had to create your own landing zone. Sarah turned the heavy machine gun upslope and began systematically engaging every position where she'd seen muzzle flashes. The DSHK could reach out much farther than the Taliban AK-47s, and its heavy rounds could penetrate cover that would stop rifle bullets. She worked methodically from right to left, suppressing each fighting position in turn. The Taliban fighters were tough and experienced, but they weren't stupid. Facing effective fire from a heavy machine gun, they began withdrawing to positions farther up the mountainsides. This gave Sarah a temporary breathing space and opened up a larger area where the helicopter might be able to land safely. But she was burning through ammunition fast. The DSHK had maybe 200 rounds left on the current belt, and she could see at least 4 more groups of fighters maneuvering for better positions. Once her suppressive fire lifted, they'd be back down to contest any landing attempt. Pedro 2-4, I'm giving you covering fire, but I can't hold this position indefinitely. You need to get down here now. Roger, Viper. We're coming in hot. Keep their heads down for 30 more seconds. Sarah continued her suppressive fire, swinging the machine gun back and forth to engage any movement she could see. The barrel was starting to glow from the heat of sustained firing, but the weapon kept functioning. Soviet engineering might have been crude, but it was reliable. The Pave Hawk came in fast and steep, its door gunners adding their own fire to Sarah's. She could see the crew chief in the side door, scanning for threats while preparing to take her aboard. The helicopter flared hard just above the road, kicking up a massive cloud of dust and debris. Go, 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 came the voice over the radio. Sarah grabbed her survival pack and jumped down from the truck bed, running toward the helicopter through the swirling dust cloud. Behind her, she could hear the Taliban fighters moving down from their positions, trying to get close enough for effective shots at the rescue aircraft. She was halfway to the helicopter when an AK-47 opened fire from somewhere behind her. Sarah felt a round tug at her flight suit and another kick up dirt beside her feet. She kept running, knowing that stopping meant death for both her and the helicopter crew. The crew chief was leaning out of the Pave Hawk, one hand extended to pull her aboard. Sarah was almost there when she heard a sound that made her blood run cold, the distinctive whoosh of another RPG launch. Without thinking, she dove to the side, tackling the crew chief back into the helicopter as the rocket exploded against the ground where they'd both been standing a second before. Shrapnel rattled off the aircraft's armor, but the main force of the blast was absorbed by the earth. "We're taking too much fire," the pilot shouted over the intercom. "We need to go now." Sarah hauled herself fully into the helicopter as the pilot pulled power and lifted off. Through the open door, she could see Taliban fighters running down toward their abandoned positions, firing wildly at the departing aircraft. A few rounds sparked off the fuselage, but none found anything vital. As they climbed away from the valley floor, Sarah looked back at the scene below. The white pickup truck sat abandoned on the road, its machine gun pointing skyward. Taliban fighters were swarming around it, probably trying to figure out how an American pilot had managed to turn their own weapon against them. But Sarah wasn't safe yet. Looking out the helicopter's windows, she could see more vehicles moving along the mountain roads, reinforcements responding to the sound of the firefight. The Taliban had been caught off guard once, but they were regrouping quickly. Pedro 2-4. Be advised, we've got more vehicles moving in from the east and south. This whole area is going to be swarming with hostiles in about 10 minutes. Copy, Viper. We see them on our sensors. We're taking you to a forward operating base about 20 minutes flight time from here. You'll be safe there until we can arrange transport back to Bagram. Sarah settled back into the helicopter's jump seat and tried to process what had just happened. Less than an hour ago, she'd been flying a routine mission in a state-of-the-art fighter aircraft. Now she was covered in dirt and rock dust, her flight suit torn and stained with blood, having just fought her way out of a Taliban ambush using their own weapons. The crew chief handed her a bottle of water and a first aid kit. "You okay, ma'am? You took a pretty good beating down there." Sarah took inventory of her injuries. Her ankle was still tender from the parachute landing, she had cuts and scrapes from sliding down the rocky slope, and her ears were ringing from all the gunfire. But she was alive and whole, which was more than she'd had any right to expect an hour ago. "I'll live," she told the crew chief. "Thanks for coming to get me. Things were getting a little interesting down there." The man grinned. "Ma'am, in 8 years of flying rescue missions, I've never seen anything like what you just pulled off. Taking on a dozen Taliban with a pistol, then turning their own machine gun against them? That's going to be one hell of a story back at base." Through the helicopter's window, Sarah could see the sun setting behind the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. It had been a very long day, and it wasn't over yet. There would be debriefings, medical checks, and probably a lot of paperwork explaining how she'd lost a $40 million aircraft. But she was alive, and that was what mattered. The Taliban had learned a hard lesson about underestimating American pilots, even when they were shot down and on the ground. And Sarah had learned something about herself, that when everything went wrong and the odds were stacked against her, she could still find a way to fight back and survive. The radio crackled one more time. "Viper 17, this is Bagram Control. We've been monitoring Pedro 24's transmissions. Are you injured, and do you require immediate medical attention?" Sarah keyed the radio and looked out at the darkening mountains below. Somewhere down there, Taliban fighters were probably still trying to figure out what had hit them. She smiled grimly at the thought. "Bagram, Viper 17. I'm beat up but operational. Thanks for getting the cavalry to me so quickly. It made all the difference." "Roger, Viper. Welcome back to the land of the living. We'll have medical and intelligence personnel standing by when you arrive at the FOB. Good job out there." Sarah closed her eyes and let the steady rhythm of the helicopter's rotors wash over her. The hardest part was behind her now. But as she drifted toward an exhausted sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that her war wasn't over yet. The Taliban had a long memory, and they didn't like being embarrassed. This fight might be finished, but something told her it wasn't the last one she'd have to face. The forward operating base appeared out of the darkness like an island of light in the hostile mountains. Sarah could see the perimeter lights marking the defensive positions, the glow of the landing pad, and the reassuring bulk of concrete barriers and guard towers that meant safety. After the chaos of the valley floor, the sight of American flags and military vehicles was more beautiful than any sunset. The Pave Hawk settled onto the landing pad with a gentle bump, its rotors still turning as ground crew rushed forward to secure the aircraft. Sarah gathered her survival pack and prepared to step back onto solid ground for the first time since she'd ejected from her dying F-16 several hours ago. "Welcome to Firebase Sledgehammer," the crew chief shouted over the rotor noise. "Medical and intel folks are already waiting for you in the operations building. Good luck with the debrief, ma'am." Sarah climbed down from the helicopter and was immediately met by a medic and a security team. The medic, a young sergeant with kind eyes and gentle hands, quickly looked her over for obvious injuries, while the security personnel formed a protective circle around them. "How are you feeling, Captain?" the medic asked, shining a pen light into her eyes to check for concussion. "Any dizziness, nausea, or severe pain?" Sarah took inventory again. Her ankle was still tender, and she had numerous cuts and bruises from her slide down the mountainside, but nothing felt serious. "I'm sore and tired, but nothing's broken. My ankle might be sprained from the parachute landing." The medic nodded and made notes on a clipboard. "We'll get you properly checked out in the aid station, but you look pretty good considering what you've been through. The intel guys are eager to talk to you, but medical comes first." They escorted her to a small but well-equipped medical facility inside the base's main compound. Sarah was surprised to see how substantial Firebase's sledgehammer was. It looked more like a permanent installation than the temporary outpost she'd expected. There were proper buildings instead of tents, paved roads between the facilities, and enough vehicles and personnel to suggest a significant military presence. In the aid station, a flight surgeon thoroughly examined Sarah's injuries. The ankle was indeed sprained, but not badly, and most of her cuts were superficial. The doctor cleaned and bandaged the worst of the scrapes, gave her anti-inflammatory medication for the swelling, and pronounced her fit for duty with light restrictions. "You're incredibly lucky," the flight surgeon told her as he finished his examination. "Shot down in hostile territory, pursued by enemy fighters, and you walked away with minor injuries. Someone upstairs must like you." Sarah thought about the Taliban fighters she'd left behind in the valley and the heavy machine gun that had turned the tide of the battle. "I think it was more about preparation and training than luck, and having good people watching my back." Before she could rest, Sarah was escorted to the intelligence section for her debrief. The facility was much more sophisticated than she'd expected from a forward base. With satellite communication equipment, multiple computer workstations, and wall-mounted displays showing real-time intelligence feeds from across the region. Major Rebecca Torres, the base intelligence officer, greeted Sarah with coffee and a warm meal, the first real food she'd eaten since breakfast at Bagram. Torres was a sharp-eyed woman in her early 30s who had clearly been briefed on the basics of Sarah's ordeal. "Captain Mitchell, I know you've had a hell of a day, but we need to get your account while the details are still fresh. What you experienced out there could provide valuable intelligence about Taliban operations in this sector." Sarah settled into a comfortable chair and began recounting her story from the moment her F-16 started experiencing system failures. Torres took detailed notes and occasionally asked for clarification on specific points: the number of fighters she'd observed, their weapons and equipment, their level of tactical discipline, and their apparent command structure. "The way you describe their movement and coordination suggests these weren't just local insurgents," Torres observed. "They moved like trained soldiers and had good equipment. That matches with other reports we've been getting from this area recently." Sarah nodded. "They definitely knew what they were doing. The way they spread out and used proper fire and movement techniques when they were advancing up the mountainside, that takes training and experience." Torres pulled up a map on her computer screen and asked Sarah to identify the location of the engagement as precisely as possible. Sarah studied the terrain features and was able to pinpoint the valley where her aircraft had gone down and where the subsequent firefight had taken place. "This is very helpful," Torres said, marking the locations. "We've been tracking increased Taliban activity in this region over the past few weeks, but we haven't had good intelligence on their strength or capabilities. Your observations fill in some important gaps." The questioning continued for over an hour, covering every detail of Sarah's experience from the crash to her rescue. Torres was particularly interested in the improvised fighting vehicles and the heavy weapons the Taliban fighters had been carrying. "The fact that they had a DSHK mounted on a pickup truck suggests they're getting better equipment from somewhere," Torres noted. "Those weapons don't grow on trees, and mounting them properly takes some mechanical expertise." Sarah described her desperate battle for control of the machine gun and how she'd used it to suppress the Taliban positions long enough for the rescue helicopter to extract her. Torres listened intently, occasionally asking for technical details about the weapon's condition and ammunition supply. "Captain, what you did out there was nothing short of remarkable," Torres said when the formal debrief was complete. "Turning an enemy weapon against them and holding off a superior force until rescue arrived, that's going to become part of Air Force survival training curriculum." Before Sarah could respond, an alarm klaxon sounded throughout the base. Red lights began flashing, and she could hear the sound of vehicles starting up outside the intelligence building. Torres immediately turned to a radio and began monitoring communications. "This is Firebase Sledgehammer Control to all units. We have movement on the eastern perimeter. Multiple vehicles approaching from Grid Square 74 Alpha. All defensive positions. Maintain alert status." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. Could that be related to what happened earlier? Taliban reinforcements looking for revenge? Torres was already pulling up surveillance feeds on her computer. The base's cameras and sensors provided a real-time view of the approaches to Firebase Sledgehammer, and Sarah could see the distinctive dust clouds that marked vehicles moving across the desert floor. "Possibly," Torres said grimly. "The Taliban don't usually attack well-defended positions directly. But if they're particularly angry about losing face today, they might try something stupid." The radio crackled with reports from the perimeter guards. "Control, this is Tower 3. I count at least 6 vehicles in the lead element, possibly more behind them. They're moving slowly and staying in formation. Looks deliberate, not like a random patrol." Sarah moved to the window and could see soldiers throughout the base taking defensive positions. Machine gun teams were manning their posts on the perimeter walls, and she could see the distinctive outlines of Humvees moving to reinforce key positions. Whatever was coming, Firebase Sledgehammer was ready for it. Torres handed Sarah a radio headset. "You might want to listen to this. If these are the same fighters you tangled with earlier, your insight could be valuable." The base commander came on the radio network, his voice calm and professional despite the potential threat approaching his position. "All stations, this is Sledgehammer 6. We have multiple vehicles approaching from the east. Rules of engagement remain in effect. Do not fire unless fired upon or unless vehicles breach the warning markers." Sarah watched the surveillance feeds as the Taliban convoy drew closer. She could make out the details now. Pickup trucks with armed men in their beds moving in a loose column formation. It looked similar to the force she'd encountered in the valley, though these vehicles appeared to be in better condition. "They're stopping," reported one of the perimeter guards. "About 800 meters out, just beyond effective small arms range. Looks like they're setting up positions." Torres studied the display intently. "They're smart enough not to drive straight into our kill zone, but they're also not leaving. This feels like they're preparing for something." The answer came when Sarah spotted a familiar sight on the surveillance feed, another pickup truck with a heavy machine gun mounted in its bed. The vehicle was positioning itself on a small ridge that gave it a clear field of fire toward the base's main gate. "Torres, look at that truck on the ridge. They've got another DSAK up there. Same setup I dealt with in the valley. If they're planning to attack, that gun gives them the range to reach most of our defensive positions." Torres immediately got on the radio to the base commander. "Sledgehammer 6, intelligence. We have a heavy machine gun position establishing on the eastern ridge, approximately 900 meters from the main gate. Recommend immediate indirect fire on that position." "Roger, intelligence. I see it. Fire mission going out now." Within minutes, Sarah could hear the distinctive sound of mortar rounds being fired from somewhere inside the base perimeter. The shells arced out toward the Taliban position, and she watched the surveillance feed as explosions bloomed around the machine gun truck. The Taliban response was immediate. Small arms fire erupted from multiple positions as the convoy spread out and began engaging the base's defensive positions. The heavy machine gun on the ridge had apparently survived the mortar attack and was now sending streams of tracer fire toward Firebase Sledgehammer. "All units, we are now in contact," announced the base commander. "Weapons free on identified hostile positions." Sarah found herself in the strange position of being a spectator to a battle that she had probably started. If the Taliban were here because of her escape from the valley, then American soldiers were now fighting because of her actions. It was a sobering thought. The base's defensive systems proved their worth quickly. Automated gun systems engaged the Taliban vehicles with precision fire, while mortar crews walked their rounds onto enemy positions with devastating effect. The Taliban had clearly expected to catch a sleeping outpost off guard, not engage a fully alert and well-equipped fire base. "They're withdrawing," reported one of the guard towers. "Vehicles pulling back to the east. It looks like they're breaking contact." Sarah watched the surveillance feeds as the Taliban convoy retreated into the darkness, leaving behind at least 2 burning vehicles and numerous casualties. The entire engagement had lasted less than 20 minutes, but it had been intense and decisive. Torres turned to Sarah with a wry smile. "Congratulations, Captain. I think you just cost the Taliban a significant chunk of their local fighting force. First, you took their machine gun and used it against them, and now you led them into attacking a prepared position. They're going to remember you." The thought wasn't entirely comforting. Sarah realized that by surviving and fighting back, she'd probably made herself a target for Taliban revenge. Her war had definitely not ended with her rescue from the valley. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. "Do I go back to Bagram and resume flying missions?" Torres considered the question carefully. "That's going to be up to higher command, but my guess is that they'll want to move you to a different area of operations. The Taliban in this sector now have a personal grudge against you, and that makes you a high-value target." Sarah spent the night in a secure quarters building, finally getting her first real sleep since before her morning mission briefing at Bagram. She was exhausted, but her mind kept replaying the events of the day. The crash, the pursuit up the mountainside, the desperate fight for control of the machine gun, and now the attack on Firebase Sledgehammer. It all seemed surreal. The next morning brought a surprise visitor. Colonel Patricia Hayes, the wing commander from Bagram, arrived by helicopter to personally debrief Sarah and assess her condition. Hayes was a tough, experienced officer who had commanded F-16 squadrons in both Iraq and Afghanistan. "Captain Mitchell," Hayes said as they sat in the base commander's office, "what you accomplished yesterday was extraordinary. You not only survived being shot down in hostile territory, but you turned the situation around and gave the enemy a bloody nose they won't soon forget." Sarah felt uncomfortable with the praise. "Ma'am, I was just trying to stay alive long enough for rescue to reach me. Everything else was just reacting to circumstances." Hayes smiled. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that kept you alive and made you effective. You didn't panic when things went bad. You adapted and overcame. That's what separates good pilots from exceptional ones." The colonel's expression became more serious. "However, your situation has become complicated. Intelligence reports indicate that the Taliban leadership in this region has put a bounty on your head. They're embarrassed by what happened yesterday and they want payback." Sarah had expected this news, but hearing it confirmed still made her stomach tighten. "What does that mean for my tour here?" "It means we're transferring you to a different theater of operations," Hayes replied. "You'll finish your deployment flying missions over northern Afghanistan, where the Taliban presence is lighter and the threat to you personally is reduced. After that, you'll rotate back to the States for some well-deserved leave." Sarah nodded, understanding the logic, but feeling slightly disappointed. She'd been looking forward to getting back in the cockpit and continuing the mission, but she also recognized that staying in this area would put not only herself, but also her wingmen and support personnel at additional risk. "There's one more thing," Hayes continued. "The Air Force is considering recommending you for the Silver Star for your actions yesterday. What you did, fighting through enemy positions and holding them off long enough for rescue, meets the criteria for exceptional gallantry in action against an enemy." The possibility of such a high decoration was both humbling and overwhelming. Sarah had always done her job to the best of her ability, but she'd never considered herself a hero. Yesterday had just been about survival and doing whatever it took to get home. "Ma'am, I appreciate the consideration, but I was just doing what any pilot would do in the same situation." Hayes shook her head. "Captain, I've been in this business for 20 years. And I can tell you that not every pilot would have made the choices you made yesterday. Most would have tried to hide and wait for rescue. You took the fight to the enemy and won. That deserves recognition." Later that morning, Sarah climbed aboard another helicopter for the flight back to Bagram. As they lifted off from Firebase Sledgehammer, she looked down at the base that had provided her sanctuary after her ordeal in the valley. The defensive positions were still manned, and she could see work crews repairing damage from the previous night's attack. The flight back to Bagram gave Sarah time to think about everything that had happened. 24 hours ago, she'd been a routine fighter pilot conducting standard missions. Now she was being transferred to a new area of operations and potentially recommended for a major decoration. Her war had changed in ways she never could have anticipated. At Bagram, Sarah was greeted by her squadron mates with a mixture of relief and amazement. Word of her ordeal had spread quickly through the pilot community, and everyone wanted to hear the story firsthand. Sarah found herself recounting the events multiple times, each helping her process what she'd experienced. Her flight lead, Major Steve Kowalski, summed up what everyone was thinking. "Sarah, in 15 years of flying fighters, I've never heard of anything like what you pulled off. You should be dead or captured, and instead you're here telling us how you turned the Taliban's own gun against them. That's going to be a bar story for the rest of your life." As Sarah settled back into the routine of squadron life, she realized that yesterday's experience had changed her in ways she was still discovering. She'd always been confident in her abilities as a pilot, but now she knew she could handle herself on the ground as well. More importantly, she'd learned that when everything went wrong and the odds were stacked against her, she could still find a way to fight back and survive. The Taliban had shot down her aircraft and tried to capture her, but they'd gotten more than they bargained for. Instead of a helpless prisoner, they'd faced a determined fighter who refused to give up. And in the end, it was they who had paid the price for underestimating her. Sarah looked out at the mountains surrounding Bagram Airfield and thought about the valley where it had all happened. Somewhere out there, Taliban fighters were probably still trying to figure out how an American pilot had turned their ambush into a disaster for their own forces. She hoped the lesson would stick, not just for them, but for any other enemy who might think American pilots were easy targets when they were shot down. Her war was far from over, but Sarah now knew something about herself that she hadn't known before. When the chips were down and everything seemed hopeless, she had what it took to fight back and win, and that knowledge would stay with her for the rest of her military career, no matter where her next mission might take her. The F-16 might have been lost, but the pilot had come home with something even more valuable: the absolute certainty that she could face anything the enemy threw at her and still find a way to survive and fight back. That was worth more than any aircraft, and it was a lesson the Taliban would not soon forget.